Hi, I'm Dr. Jenny Grant Rankin, and I'm a Fulbright specialist for the U.S. Department of State and an author who's written many books on data and a lecturer. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the key ways to get people to move by using data. First off, we know you want to visualize data, but you want to be sure you visualize it for particular insights. I'll tell you a quick story. Back in 1854, in an area of London that's now Soho, people started dying mysteriously and nobody knew why. And the UK had its first official statistician at the time, William Farr, and he put together many displays. Some of them were visualized, some of them were graphed, some were in little tables like this. And he organized them around some different theories, but nothing really stood out and not much happened. People were still dying and they still did not know why 500 people died in just 10 days. And then along came John Snow, but he didn't look like this John Snow, some of you might know. This was Dr. John Snow, and he wanted to figure out why people were dying. He lived in the area, he was a doctor. And so he went around knocking on doors, talking to people, finding out what was going on. And he put together a very different data display. Instead of just throwing the data at the viewer, he organized it around some insights that he was starting to form that had to do with how close people lived to the Broad Street water pump. He put little marks on the map to represent the deaths in the houses or sometimes the businesses. And through this map, he was able to show that the closer people were to the Broad Street water pump, the more likely they were to die. And this is how they identified that it was a cholera epidemic. And he used this map to convince local officials to remove the handle from the Broad Street water pump that ended the epidemic. And it was because he had walked around knocking on doors. He knew the important insights that had to be taken from the data. And so he used a data display that communicated that very clearly. He was very selective, not just in the data he was showing, but in the display as well. And that's how he was able to save so many lives and actually became a tool in the future to prove germ theory as well, to save other lives too. And that also relates to a message that he wanted to get across. You want to be sure that you don't just throw data at people like this. Now, here we've pulled out, let's say we have some data on people who are of Generation Z. And let's say we want to communicate that data to college professors who are teaching these students. And if you can pull out some statistics, it does, it does focus it a little bit for the viewer, but the viewer still is going to look at this and just forget it. It's not organized around a really clear message. So you want to consider your audience, consider what message they need, and then organize the data that way. For example, if I were presenting this data to college professors about Generation Z students, I wouldn't show this. Instead, I would tell them, you know what, we're going to talk about Generation Z for a little bit. I would ground them. I would say these are people who were born between 96 and 2010. And so they're anywhere from 12 to 26 years old, which means a lot of them are in college right now. Well, what do we know about them? We know that we're really frustrated by their use of electronic devices in classes. Professors are always complaining about this. But let's think about, what do we know about their relationship with these tools? For example, when we take this device away, research shows us that 79% of Generation Zers, they actually experience emotional distress emotional distress when their device is taken away. And we can laugh at this, but let's go ahead and dig into why. What is it about their relationship that would cause such distress when they don't have that tool? So let's use some pie charts for a little bit, okay? Well, 85% of Gen Zers see this device as a tool they use to access lessons and do research and learn online. And we also know that 60% of them report that they use their devices to share information. It actually has to do with collaboration and working as teams and helping other people out. We also know that 76% of them report that they feel this device is needed for them to achieve their goals. That's a significant chunk of those individuals. And when it does come to goals, 80% of Gen Zers feel that they are more driven than their peers. Now, we can laugh at this because we know only 50% of them could be more driven and 50% of them less driven. There's no way 80% could be above what is established to be average. But we could laugh at that, but we could also take a look at the fact that Gen Zers do have a certain reputation, and 80% are saying that label isn't me. I'm more driven than that. So it also tells us that maybe we're getting them wrong in how we have them pegged. So when we consider all of this, we realize that those devices are a tool that they feel they need to achieve their goals, and they're feeling they're driven enough to achieve those goals, but they need this device for that. So now when we take a look at data on how they're emotionally distressed when that device goes away, now we can have some more understanding and more sympathy. Now, both of those examples were sharing the same data, but one of them, it wasn't that it was just visualized, it was organized. The way I was sharing it around a clear message that I pulled ahead of time by looking at the data. Now, I wouldn't have come to a conclusion by looking at that small amount of data. Of course, I'd be looking at a lot more, but you don't have to inundate your audience with all of it. You can give them access to it, of course, but when you're trying to get something important across, you want to stick to the message. Also, you don't want to just give them that data or say, here is the message. It's best to include some sort of story with a focus that gets the message across. For example, one thing we know is if we share a statistic with people, they just don't tend to connect. Even if it is a very human statistic, there's something going on in the brain that causes people not to connect to it, because even if we visualize it, we're analyzing it. And I'll talk more about what's happening up here that prevents us from connecting. These numbers are just dry for most people. And we find that when we include a story, when we humanize the data, suddenly people start connecting. Instead of just giving the data, we also connect some kind of story with it. Now, we find that this happens, that people connect more, but why is that? Well, let's look at what's happening in the brain. When we're analyzing data, when we're looking at something where we're problem solving, we're analyzing, we're using the cerebral cortex in the brain, and it's an area where we tend to shut down other things like emotion because we're trying to be objective, right? That's important with data use. But when we're in that mode, we're less likely to care about something, to remember it, and to act on it. But on the other hand, stories engage way more parts of the brain, and they make us more likely, especially an emotional story, to care about what we're hearing about, to remember it, to act on it. So how can we take this knowledge of the brain and apply it to our data sharing? Well, let's take an example from real life. I'll take you to 2015. And in 2015, there were 22 million people in Syria right before the Syrian civil war began. But when that war hit, 2015, we know that 61% of them were reported by the United Nations as requiring humanitarian assistance. Most of those, the vast majority, were displaced. 6 million were displaced in other areas of Syria than their homes, and 5 million were outside of Syria, refugees needing to be taken in. Now, this data was all over the news. People were getting this data, but we just weren't acting on it until one day an image hit the internet. And I've opted not to show you the actual image, just a suggestion of it, because you probably saw it and remember it. It looked like this. It was a shoreline. But the difference was there was a little boy in a red shirt lying face down, 3 years old, deceased. He was a refugee from Syria. His family put him on a boat, very desperate to get to safety, as so many families were, and just as we would be if our families were at risk of not surviving a civil war. But he didn't make it like so many others. And this image hit the internet with the story, the fact that he actually had people willing to take him in, but a paperwork glitch interfered with him getting to relatives in Canada. That detail hit the internet, as well as the fact that these people were desperate. They needed countries to open their doors. They needed donations. They needed assistance in getting safe passage. And when this story hit the internet, there was a 750% increase in donations to just one very important charity within 24 hours of this story hitting the internet. Canada immediately worked on reworking its visa policies and paperwork policies, and so many countries stepped up to increase thousands more to increase the number of Syrian refugees they were taking in. Even Pope Francis spoke out about the country's need to do this. So many people got involved. So many people donated. So many people changed legislation because that story hit. But you needed both the data and the story. We know that when only the data was out there, people tend to disconnect. They're not in that emotional frame of mind where they're caring enough to act. And if just the story hit the internet, it could seem like an isolated event. We needed the data to know what a big problem this was, but we needed the story to connect to it. So how can you take this information and apply it to your data, whatever data you're sharing with people? Well, one topic I speak on a lot because of my involvement in Mensa and one of my books on giftedness is I'll give keynotes at education conferences, and I'm talking generally to teachers about the fact that there is a lot of discrimination in how kids are identified as gifted in our country. We know, of course, that no matter your race, ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic status, you are just as likely to be intellectually gifted as somebody else. But to pull just one stat out of the many that went into this data display, if you are Black, for example, in the United States, and you have identical test scores, so identical data, identical test scores, as a child who is white, you are half as likely to be identified by the school as gifted. Obviously, there is bias at play, and lots of it, that blind bias, teachers wanting to help, but they're going on their image of what they feel genius looks like, images from the media, the fact that they connect more with a student who is their same color. We know most teachers are white in public school. There are a lot of factors. And when I share this data, not only is my audience of teachers going to have the very human reaction of maybe looking at and thinking, yes, I care, but not connecting, because people just don't tend to connect with just data. But there's also a threat to identity here, which makes it particularly hard to accept, because we know that teachers really care. 95% of teachers got into the industry because they wanted to make a difference. They have good intentions, but this is not maybe positioning the teacher in the best role. So before I show them this data, I pick a story that's very sensitive to their identity, and it makes the data a lot easier to accept. And I tell them about Gail. And Gail grew up between Los Angeles and San Diego, and she had a lot of trouble in school. She had many behavior problems, many problems at home to begin with. So there was abuse and neglect, and when she was at school, she often butted heads with teachers. One teacher would lock her in a closet. She was told that she was not academically ready or socially ready for second grade. So she was held back in first grade. Little girl, Gail, very, very young. And she was often told by adults that she was stupid, very, very frequently, and including teachers. And this is Gail today. This is Dr. Gail Thompson. She's a dear friend of mine, and she's given me her blessing to share her story. She is a tireless advocate for students, particularly students from traditionally, historically, not treated well populations. And she did go on to graduate high school. She graduated college. After a stint in the Peace Corps, she earned her Ph.D. She became a teacher herself. She has written so many books. I could not even name them all for you, and they're fabulous. She's won so many awards. She became a nationally endowed professor. She has done so much for so many students. And so I tell this story to my crowd of teachers, and I ask, who do you think it was that made that difference in Dr. Thompson's life to help get her to this point? And my audience tells me a teacher. And they're right. It was a teacher who helped this little girl become this woman, because that teacher, her sixth grade teacher, recognized that Gail was not stupid, as adults had been telling her. She was actually extremely, and my audience can tell me, gifted. She had things going on at home. Her family was on welfare. You know, there were all kinds of issues that had to be remedied to help her do well in school. And she could just take that ball and run it if she had that one teacher who really believed in her. But she almost slipped through the cracks. She almost was recognized as not gifted and treated like she was stupid and not given those proper programs and so on. And then I share this data with my audience. And I point out, of course, that Dr. Thompson is female, that Dr. Thompson is Black, and that as a child at that time, Gail was poor, right? Gail is an example of that data. And because I chose a story where teachers were the heroes, right? We know first some were getting it wrong in a horrible way. But thank God that one teacher got it right. And so now I can appeal to my crowd of teachers. Hey, so many educators are not getting it right when it comes to recognizing which of their kids are gifted. And we can go into the details of why, because now my audience is going to care about it, because I paired the story with the data. Now, if I just gave them the data, people don't tend to connect, even people as wonderful as teachers. If I just gave the story, it could seem like an isolated event. It's the two things together that can work. So each of the strategies I've shared can help you move people with data. You want to have a clear message. You want to visualize the data around that message, around a particular focus. And when you pick your stories, you want to have that focus too, on what you're trying to get across, What is the message in the data that can really move people? And be careful in your story selection so that it's sensitive to people's identity and appeals to their identity so that they really feel, hey, I care about this data and I'm somebody who wants to act on what I see. Thank you for your time.